So hello, I'm John Kane, and I welcome you to Let's Talk Native on this Tuesday, August 13th. While this program may not provide a path to spiritual enlightenment, we do encourage and in some cases start conversations. We don't do prayers, and we don't do buffalo speeches. We take a tough look at history, oppression, and survival. We talk about culture, the arts, politics, and identity. And we may step on a few toes along the way, but our real goal here is to bring people together by breaking down what separates us. We will take on the false narratives and provide critical thinking to all that is heaped upon us. And we do it all right here live from the Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation. So let's talk Native. But let me remind people that our audio streams live at www.letstalknative.com. We stream the video live on Facebook Live, on our Facebook group pages. Our shows are available as podcasts on your favorite podcast platforms, and we take the video and we put it up on our YouTube channel, which is Let's Talk Native TV. I encourage you to subscribe to the YouTube channel and subscribe to the podcast, and that way you'll never miss a show. You'll always have notifications of new shows. And of course, on our YouTube channel, we also do we do short form videos as well on various subjects, and we're due, in fact, we're overdue for a new one. So again, subscribe to the channel, and you'll catch it. Look, I'm the host of the show, and I am joined in studio by Jake Proud, who is managing our video and our sound. So let's get into it. All right, as I posted on Facebook the general topic, and I asked the question: what's the difference between Native people and non-Native people? What's the difference between our land and their land? Us and them, here and there. What's the differences? And the reason I even got into this subject was has to do with the tax issues. Excuse me. And it has to do with the tax issues. We're always in a battle with the federal government and the state government. And of course, most people assume, and again, this kind of gets into the whole definitions issue, they assume that we don't pay any taxes. I mean, a lot of, Native and non-Native people think that we are, exempt from all of these other things, right? And that some people think we get a bunch of money from the government, and we're all on welfare, and I mean, there's a whole. They think we all go to college for free, all kinds of things like that. And I think it's important that people understand some of the truths associated with it. And look, this isn't a question of who are better people. It's not that. It's what are the differences. And what are the distinctions? And part of it is because I think people need to understand that even with the handicaps that come with being Native and living on Native lands, we don't want to assimilate. Our goal is not to be Americans. I mean, that's not really what our goal is. I mean, I'm not saying there aren't Native people who kind of sign up to that whole patriotism and and look, we've got Native people who are Christians, who are veterans, who are, who are voters, all kinds of stuff like that. But to a person, there's almost no one, especially living on Native lands, and I would say most of us who don't live right within a Native community, none of us want that distinction to go away. We don't want to lose that identity as Native people. So let's talk a little bit about that identity. First, there is that question about citizenship. When the United States was formed, and they wrote into their Constitution, certain authorities that the federal government had and how the government was going to work and that kind of thing. In Article 1, Section 2 of the U.S. Constitution, it was considered the apportionment clause, and what the apportionment clause was for was both for the apportionment of taxes and for representation, Congress. So how would you determine how many congressmen would be put out there for each colony? Well, it was based on population. So how do you count that population? So when they were figuring out the apportionment of representation for Congress, or for the House of Representatives specifically, they talked about who would be counted, and of course it was always men. It wasn't even women. 3/5 of a slave, but it would exclude Native people, and it said excluding. And again, they're talking about who was going to be counted, and it says excluding Indians not taxed. So in that one statement, in the apportionment clause of the U.S. Constitution, the United States was recognizing from the beginning that we both didn't pay taxes and that we were not a part of their Constitution, that we were not represented by them. It was not our Constitution, that although we were living in the same places, we had, although the borders weren't always that clearly defined in the beginning, but certainly there were Native people living in close proximity to non-Native people. But it was very clear right from the start that we were distinct, that we weren't the same. We weren't slaves. We weren't indentured servants. We weren't free white men. But we were different and separate, and that we were not a part of their system. So that's right from the beginning. Now, keep in mind, this is late 18th century. This is what's the Constitution, 1787 or something along those lines. So that's clearly defined there. Now, you go a little bit later into that same century. I mean, talk about the Canandaigua Treaty. We know that as lines were being drawn, they, not us, they could clearly define, okay, where were the edges of our territories and what territories would we allow them to utilize. The federal government under George Washington had all these lines drawn, and they said, this is, the Seneca territory is defined as this, this, and this. And they said, and the United States will acknowledge that land is yours. And we will never claim the same, nor will we disturb you in the free use and enjoyment of the land. So again, let me back that up. So the United States says, specifically the Senecas, but all Six Nations, basically. But the territories of the Seneca Nation, they said, the lands that you were retaining, not that we aren't carving up in this treaty, that they are yours, and the United States acknowledges that it's yours, and the United States will never claim your lands. So that's what the federal government under George Washington in the Treaty of Canandaigua. Look, I'm not saying it was a good treaty, or I'm not saying anything like that. I'm just saying their language in their document, specifically, this is 1794 now, they are saying that your land is not part of the United States. Forget about it. It's not part of New York State either. I mean, it's not a part of the United States. And they make there's no ambiguity there. The only thing they say is that, and it'll be yours until you decide to sell it. Should you decide to sell it. And what they tried to suggest in that part of the clause was that the United States had the exclusive right to buy that land from when Native people were willing to sell it. But again, clearly the United States is saying that land is yours. And of course, after that, and I know we've talked about doctrine of Christian discovery where, the Justice John Marshall 30 years later would say, well, Native people don't have any right to own title to the land. Well, obviously that is totally contradicted by the Treaty of Canandaigua. And in fact, after this case that codifies the doctrine of discovery into U.S. law, in the attempt to move Native people, when the Senecas were approached about moving to, say, Kansas, the Senecas asked the question, well, if we went there, then what would be the status of that land? And the United States again, and this is in the 1830s now. So now we're in the 19th century. And this is in the 1830s, and what they're saying is, if you leave the land that you're on now and take this land out in Kansas, that land will be yours. The United States will never claim it. It'll never be a part of U.S. territory. It'll never be turned into a state. It'll have the same status as the land that you'd be leaving. So that wasn't said to everybody. Now, the Senecas knew what language they already had, and so that was these were really important questions they were asking. And the United States completely conceded that if the Senecas left and went to Kansas, that they would that the land would be theirs. Forget, Johnson v. McIntosh, doctrine of discovery, the Indians can't hold title to land, none of that stuff. The federal government was acknowledging, first off, that the land you're on is yours, but if you are willing to move, we'll assure you that the land. Of course, the Senecas didn't move; they stayed. But again, so you're getting into the 19th century, and the United States is still acknowledging the distinction of the Seneca people and the distinction of their land. Now, again, I haven't really gotten into what that distinction is, but it's not the United States. The Senecas are not U.S. citizens. Okay, so we get later in the 19th century, slavery ends. So they passed the 14th Amendment, which you would think when you hear the language of the 14th Amendment and it talks about slaves now being citizens, black men being citizens, and the language suggests that all people born in the United States are U.S. citizens. That doesn't include us, because the language in the 14th Amendment says born in the United States and under U.S. jurisdiction are citizens of the United States. We were neither. I mean, most of us were still living on our native lands, and we weren't under U.S. jurisdiction. So in 1868, 14th Amendment gets passed, we still aren't U.S. citizens. So 1924 comes around. 1924, they take another crack at trying to make us into U.S. citizens, and they pass the Indian Citizenship Act, where they declare, both the Senate and the House, they declare that all Indians living within the continental or the geographical boundary of the United States are hereby declared Indians, or I'm sorry, hereby declared U.S. citizens. And again, provided that nothing in this act would limit their property, any of the rights or personal property or tribal property, whatever. So it gets past 1924. But you know what? That doesn't solve the problem either, because you go another 10 years later in 1934, they're trying to define what a native person is again, and so they have this whole Indian Reorganization Act thing. And again, there's this whole idea about whether Native people are under U.S. jurisdiction or not. And today, when they're looking at things like whether a Native person can get land or not through the fee to trust process, the idea of taking land and taking it out of state control and putting it in trust with the federal government, there's a rule called the 1934 rule. And that question is, were you under the jurisdiction of the United States in 1934? Well, clearly, there are people who weren't. So the 1934 thing didn't solve the citizenship question. So my point in all of this is that even with attempts to make that distinction go away, it doesn't go away. Now, we can back all the way up to the early 19th century, and I oftentimes talk about this letter between Thomas Jefferson, who was the president in 1803, and Henry Harrison, who would become president later on, but is the governor of the Indiana Territory. And Jefferson writes him a letter basically telling him, look, this is between us. It's a private letter, so I can be open and honest with you and make it clear what our strategy is with Native people. And they said, and part of that strategy is, let's cultivate their affection. Let's make them love us. Let's not do anything to upset the Native people. Let's try to keep peace, and let's make them like us. And we'll do everything again to make them like us. And here's what we're going to do. We're going to convince all of our tradesmen, all the ones who have shops, the storekeepers, to sell the Native people products at a bare bones. Sell it cheap. I mean, don't give it away. Don't lose money on it. But sell it so cheap that these Native people will love us. And you know what? Offer them lines of credit. Sell them all you can. Make it up in volume. What you can't make up in margin, make up in volume. Sell them all you can. Run them into debt. And when that debt gets too big for them to pay, we'll convince them to lop off that debt with their land. So let's bankrupt them. Let's offer them lines of credit. Let's get them in debt, and then we'll foreclose. For all intents and purposes, we'll foreclose. So this was the attempt, and of course, what Jefferson says in this letter is that. And here's the thing: once we've done this, and we've got enough of their land, we don't have to have it all. Once we have enough of it, we'll have them so integrated with us that they'll either be so uncomfortable that they'll leave and they'll go out and we'll ship them out west of the Mississippi, or they're going to have to completely assimilate, and they'll have to give up on their culture, which is terrible anyway, and it'll be the end of them as a distinct people. And he refers to this strategy as the plan for his final consolidation. Our final consolidation will be completed. Sounds a little bit like Hitler's final solution. But I bring this up because, again, Jefferson knew that that we were a distinct people, and by taking, stripping land and that kind of thing, he could make some of that distinction go away. He could either make us go away, and that's what he said. He said, "Look, and if anybody resists any of this stuff, we'll just crush them, and well, not only will we crush them and harm them and hurt them, but we'll make them all leave. We'll drive them west of the Mississippi. So if they didn't want to go willingly, we'll make them go under." So this Jefferson, who everybody thinks is the enlightened one, this enlightened president, turns out to be the most devious of them all. He's got a multi-pronged approach, one that involves, toxic lines of credit, a way to and even refers to this is a way that we can take their land and not even offend them. We'll make it sound like we did them a favor taking that land off their hand to satisfy these debts, because we've already convinced them that they need this stuff that we have, our pots, our pans, our garden utensils, all that stuff. And again, we'll give it to them cheap, because we want them to run in debt. And so that was Jefferson's plan. So again, I mentioned this stuff to highlight that distinction. Now here's the problem. Jefferson's plan didn't work. And it worked in a large way. It did work, I will say. 95% of our land base, 90% of our population was eliminated through this strategy, but we didn't all go. So where I say the plan failed, the complete genocide didn't happen. We're still here. And even here in the East, which is, sometimes people think that's remarkable. So we're still here. So when we ask that question today, what is that distinction? Well, I would still argue, even though there are plenty of Native people, Seneca people, who will say, "Oh, I'm an American. Yeah, I'm an American." And they made me American in 1924. I mean, those are people who just don't know any better to say anything else other than that. But the reality is, we get to choose. I mean, let's not forget, the United States claims in their Declaration of Independence that just authority, just power, only comes from the consent of the governed. Well, we never gave consent to that. You pass a law that unilaterally tries to make us U.S. citizens, that doesn't mean that we agreed to that. And in fact, when they passed that law in 1924, our people rejected it, especially when draft notices started coming out for World War II. So, again, there is a big question mark about even our citizenship as we live on Native territories. But some of the biggest distinction is our Native territories. And the fact that the reason we have a word like Ungwe is because it talks about us being a real human being forever. And to be a real human being, you have to have a connection to land. You have to have a connection to the land of your ancestors. I mean, most Americans, U.S. citizens, they can only go back so far. They don't have a deep connection. I mean, look, you got Americans that claim to be Italians. Well, you're not really Italian. You have no connection to Italy. You don't even speak the language. Yeah, you don't have a hometown that you can associate where you come from, or you're Irish. And as far as black people, most of those people were ripped away in chains out of Africa, and so the population that of 14% of the U.S. population is black. Many of those are, they're descendants of slaves. So they had that cord cut between them and their relationship to land. So they're here without that connection. Same with, all white people, Asian, population, Japanese, Chinese, Koreans, Vietnamese, Filipinos, all the other Haitians, everybody who's here, for whatever reason, doesn't have the same connection that Native people, indigenous people, the original people, Ungwe have. So that's part of it. So part of what makes us so distinct is the fact that we do have places that the land is not part of New York State, that it's not part of the United States. So what does life on a Native territory look like? And I think even Native people can sometimes ignore that distinction. I mean, look, we live in houses, we drive cars, we wear blue jeans, we got TV with, we don't have cable, at least not here in Cattaraugus, but we've got Dish Network and DirecTV, and we've got, crappy internet. We don't have high-speed internet. No, we don't have that. But we have roads and cars and garages and streetlights and, but what's the difference? Well, the biggest difference is for only, we don't pay taxes here. And when I say we don't, there's no taxes imposed on Senecas by Senecas. Taxing is not something that's part of our culture. So we don't have taxes. Outside has taxes, and they try every day at the state and federal level and other levels. I mean, every phone bill we got has a little hidden tax and fee in there that we got to fight them over. Every product and service we get, we have to fight them to the extent we can on paying taxes on products that we use and consume here. I mean, it's easy if something comes it's delivered here, but this is one of the battles we have, and this battle rages on continuously at the state and the federal level. I mean, look, I talk about the state trying to fleece the Senecas for another $1 billion after getting $1.5 billion out of gaming revenue. There's no way you can define what the state is trying to impose on the Senecas as anything but a tax. It's a tax. I mean, they're not giving the Senecas something of value. It's, so they can call it a revenue sharing, but now they even had a couple of white guys on an arbitration panel say, no, you got to pay it. So now it's an imposed. It's forced on the Senecas. That's a tax. Now, do we have the right to fight it? Absolutely. And does the state have the right to tax us? No, they don't. But see, even though we can argue that the state doesn't have the right to tax, or the federal government for that matter, there's an assumption that they do. They make that assumption. And one of the ways they make that assumption is to do the opposite of what I'm doing here, which is to fail to recognize our distinction. They want to say, oh, no, look, yeah, you're native, but you're just an American. You're a New Yorker just like the rest of us. No, we're not. We're just not. And I think understanding that distinction, and I think we need to understand that distinction. Look, like I said, I understand that many Native people go to church and they've abandoned some of their customs and traditions and picked up many customs and traditions from the people around us, from the white people around us. I mean, including language. I'm speaking to you in English here. So I get that, and of course we follow their holidays, their, Easter Bunny and Santa Claus and all of that stuff. 4th of July, I saw a bunch of red, white, and blue flags on people's yards here during 4th of July. I mean, Halloween, we do all those things that have become a part of the American culture. I mean, it's not really tied directly. I mean, except for the patriotic holidays, but some of it's tied to religion. But none of that stuff is ours. But we've picked some of that up. But again, even though we have Christians and veterans and Republicans and Democrats on our territories, even those people still want to maintain at least some level of distinction for whatever that might mean. But again, some of that distinction. The land here, it's not part of New York State. There's no New York State deeds or county deeds or federal deeds for the land that's here. The Seneca Nation, writes up the deeds. They do the paperwork. The land here is not part of the United States or part of the New York State. Now that, not everybody knows that. Apparently the folks of the state don't know that. The folks in Washington don't know that because the idea that they'll even let people vote on the Native territory when really their congressional districts stop when they come to the edge of these territories. But, we've made concessions on things like policing. So there's tickets issued on the territory. Doesn't take much to fight it to not have to pay that ticket. But their roads go through here. Okay, well, who owns the roads? Well, the easements are offered up for the state roads, including the Interstate 86 down in Allegheny and Interstate 90 here in Cattaraugus. But the land's never transferred title. The Senecas own that land. So there's an easement. There's easements issued for gas lines, for electric lines, for telephone lines. There's a rail. I mean, CSX tracks go cut through Seneca territory. There, again, highways. There's interstate. There's state routes, county routes that go through Seneca territory. But those are all easements. It doesn't mean the Senecas gave the land up, even on any of those easements, any of them. So the land is not part of New York State. So the people living here are not residents of New York State. The people living here I mean, frankly, even the non-native people, and not just Senecas. I'm not Seneca. I'm Mohawk. I live here, but I'm not living in New York State. I'm living on Seneca Nation territory, and there are non-native people who live on Seneca Nation territory. Now, I'm not saying they're not Americans. I'm not saying that, but they don't live in the United States and they don't live in New York State. The land is distinct. So we don't have taxes here. There's no property taxes. There's no there's no state income tax for people who live and work here. Now it gets into a bit of a debate. If you live here and you work out there, do you pay state income tax? That's we say one thing and they say the other. But part of that is that lack of clarity about distinction. See, in some of these things, we have to decide. And we haven't been very clear about it. And we need to be. Part of the reason, I went through this exercise was over the tax issue. I mean, I've said this before on the show. It is absurd to me, especially, and to me, the most absurd example is somebody who gets elected as a councilman or an executive of the Seneca Nation. Think about somebody who gets elected on the council, and they get paid pretty well. But think about somebody who gets elected to serve the Seneca people on Seneca land. They live here. They have to. They live here. They're on council. And they get paid a pretty substantial income, sometimes around $100,000 a year. And the federal government gets a third of that? The federal government gets 30% or more of that income for a person who is, again, not a New Yorker, not an American, a Seneca, serving in Seneca Nation governance. Why the hell would the United States have a right to tax that? But see, this is where it gets nebulous and it gets confusing. Hey, we're at the bottom of the hour, so we'll pick it up when we come back. I got more to talk about. I got to talk about more about what the differences and where the conflicts come in, and I'll do that when we come back. This is John Kane. This is Let's Talk Native.
Your children in the classroom. English history. What do they teach about the Indians? Took us prisoner in your fight to be free. Telling me your little white lies. Say your lies don't hurt nobody. Only meant to know yourself.
All right, thanks for coming back. This is John Kane. This is Let's Talk Native. Hey, I want to give a shout out to my sponsors. I want to thank Ross and Holly John and the RJE family of businesses, Eric White and ERW Enterprises. A few others, one in particular remains a little bit anonymous, I guess, but I appreciate those three main sponsors that I have. And I also appreciate those of you who from time to time make a contribution, good friends like Neville Spring, Ed Schindler, my friend Cynthia Trice, a few people who, even a few folks from down New York City way, will pop a check in the mail every once in a while. And it allows us to do more of what we try to do here, enhancing our studio and, again, giving us, more tools to work with here. I also appreciate all of you that share the show, and you share the show, whether you're sharing the Facebook live stream, or whether you're sharing podcasts or YouTube videos, whatever. I appreciate all of it. Look, I mentioned in the last program that it was our 9th anniversary. So this essentially is our first show of our 10th year. So we are forging into our 10th season, our 10th year of Let's Talk Native. Couldn't do it without the support of listeners. Couldn't do it without the support of sponsors. And of course the guests. And I, as I said last time, I want to thank not only the special guests that we have, the ones who make an appearance here and there, but the regular guests, the guys like Matt Hill and Ed Schindler and Paul Delarone and Ross John, these guys who come in the studio quite often and and help us have these conversations. So I want to thank all of you. And I also want to thank you guys for offering your comments, and you guys do that in a variety of ways. Obviously on Facebook, on our YouTube channel, you can make a comment. We look for those comments from time to time as well. So thank you for all of that. All right, let me get back into it. Look, I saw a comment here that talked about being native and living off territory. Look, here's the only difference. If you're a native person and you don't live on a native territory, the difference is that where you live has a non-native person representing the territory. So they have a certain obligation to you because you live there. Now, I'm not saying that that you have to claim that public servant, but if you live off territory, then there is a congressman, there is an assemblyman, there is a senator, that a president, a governor, whatever that represents your interest because of where you live. So there's that. That doesn't make you not be a native person, but what part of what your distinction is that you do have a place that's home. I mean, even not because you live in Buffalo or Niagara Falls or Rochester or whatever else, but you have an ancestral homeland. You have a place that you can go to that is a Seneca community that you still maintain a connection with. Not all Native people have that. I'll say that. I mean, there are some people who become very urbanized, and that cord gets cut, and that's not by accident either. There's been policy. There was oftentimes people confuse. There was the removal policy, which was about removing people from Native territories and trying to clear the land. But there was also a policy that came during the Nixon administration called the relocation policy. And what relocation was about was trying to get Native people off the territory, setting them up to live in an urban environment. And that's where you end up with such a large population of Native people living in places like Minneapolis, St. Paul, and some of these other cities. So the whole idea was to try to cut that connection. And the ultimate hope was by many people in state and federal government was that they could do away with the whole reservation thing, get us convinced that life was better living in an urban environment than living in poverty in a place that's as remote as many Native territories are. So that's that was a policy. So, but no, what politicians will tell you, what state officials and even some federal officials will suggest to you, the moment you step off your territory, you're a white man. You're just like anybody else. And of course that's bullshit. But this is where that distinction is. There's an attempt at all times by state and federal officials to minimize that distinction. Now, look, I mean, we could argue, the federal government has the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and they're supposed to have a responsibility to maintain the trust relationship between the federal government and the Native territories. And of course, that's crap. That's why the Interior Department hasn't addressed this gaming issue, not just for the Senecas, for any place. 30 years of IGRA, and the Interior Department still can't even make a determination on what a Native people's do if a state tries to take advantage of them on, whether it's revenue sharing or any other part of a gaming compact. I mean, and look, the failures of the Interior Department. Look, I talk about my friends down in Shinnecock territory. They put up a freaking sign on the highway on their lands, and you can't get any intervention even from the Interior Department saying, "Well, look, state, you got to back off. They have the right to do this." No, so it just doesn't happen. So, I guess my point with this is that we don't have representation in the federal government. Oh, look, I know they put the Interior Department together. I mean, Barack Obama actually had a couple of Native people who were their senior policy advisors to the president on Native American affairs. Jody Gillette. Oh, what a coincidence. Jody Gillette, her brother was Dave Archambault out there in Standing Rock, and that's where they run a pipeline through. Yeah, that really served them very well. So we don't have representation. Now, again, if you're Native and you live in the city, and don't get me wrong, there's a lot of Native people who live in the city. There's probably 100,000 Native people living in New York City at a given time. The problem is we aren't a Native community in those cities. And even when we have a community house or a community center or, some sort of urban Native center, it oftentimes isn't enough to bring us together and be a Native community, even though clearly we'd be a diverse community, because it wouldn't just be, one group of peoples. It would be people from, everybody from Arawak in the Caribbean to, to the Northwest, to the Southwest. I mean, all over. But so we lack that sense of cohesion once we're displaced from our territory. It's only on our territories where you can maintain a fair level of that cohesion as a people. It's not to say that there isn't some diverse thoughts there either. But again, understanding the difference between our lives on our territories and the lives out there. And I want to highlight some of that. Again, we can't go down to a community bank and get a home loan to build a house on our territory. No, it doesn't happen. In fact, you can't go and get a loan to start a business. None of that stuff happens on our territories. Most of what you see on our territories is either through a Seneca Nation program specifically, or it's people who've had to dig in their own pockets and do everything with cash. Many of our businesses have a strong cash-based element to their business. Why? Because banking isn't available to us in terms of lending and financing or credit lines or any of that other stuff. So we're a little wary. I mean, yeah, we'll use banks for credit card processing, merchant accounts, and for transferring money. But we also find ourselves vulnerable because we are a cash-based business. We've had several occasions in the past, especially when we're doing mail order, where banks seized accounts. Even the Seneca Nation had $250,000 seized from an account because the federal government said, "Oh, we passed a rate increase on the federal excise tax, and you had products sitting in your store that you hadn't sold yet. So we're going to impose that tax increase after the fact." They seized $240,000 from a Seneca Nation account. I mean, so this is where our banking becomes, we're vulnerable to it. And so there's some apprehension to having, to doing business in the conventional way that anybody off territory can do. Insurances, we can't insure things the same way. Property valuation, it's hard to put a legitimate value on property because we can't sell the property in the open market. A non-native person can't come on. In fact, a non-Seneca can't come on to Seneca territory and buy property. And you sure as hell can't go borrow, get a bank loan to buy property. So there's some very clear distinctions. So when I talk about the fact that we don't have a taxing system, that's the other thing that people have to understand. The entire system of governance, programs, all of that stuff is funded through enterprise here. None of it is done through tax, and none of it is done through debt financing. I mean, the Seneca Nation can't operate in a deficit. They can't, sell bonds to cover their government expenditures. I mean, what the federal government is like I don't know, $23 trillion in debt or some damn thing. They got China buying like 7 or 8% of the entire U.S. debt is owned by foreign country by one country, China. No, none of that stuff doesn't exist here. So everything that is run here in terms of governing services programs is done through enterprise, and the main enterprise is gaming. So when I hear somebody say, "Well, the Senecas don't pay any taxes on their casinos," the hell they don't. The entire nut that comes from the profit from gaming essentially is essentially taxed. I mean, it's a government-run enterprise. See, this is the thing that people understand. The United States they don't look at their assets as a country, and they don't run businesses to generate capital for the United States. No, the only way that the United States gets money, and states get money, is by fleecing their residents through taxes, income tax, state tax, any number of excise tax, all kinds of taxes, capital gains. They have more taxes than you can imagine, and that's not what we do here. So, with all of those taxing systems, that's how that's not only how they do government programs, but it's also how they promote economic development, either directly or indirectly, again, through their systems. On Seneca territory, the only means to do economic development is either through private sector raising money, through their own businesses, or the work that they do off territory where they can bring revenue in, or through the Seneca Nation doing their enterprise. And they have a couple of stores, they have some investments, but primarily the main source of revenue for the Seneca Nation is gaming. 3 casinos, 2 bingo halls, and several other enterprises. So it's a completely different situation in terms of not only how the government runs, but how the people interact. I mean, the people don't pay the Seneca Nation. Out there, you guys all pay your state and your federal government. The question is, why should we? Why should we? And again, I go back to that absurd example of somebody who sits on Seneca Nation Council who has to have a third of their paycheck taken by the federal government. I mean, that's absurd. But it's not only absurd for him, it's absurd for for anybody. If you're a Native person, there is no reason that you should be forced. I mean, think about the idea of selling your labor. Just the whole idea. How is it possible that a state or a federal government has the right to take a piece of the sale of your labor? I mean, just let that sink in for a little bit. See, and that's not the way it works on our territory. We just don't accept that. Although we're in a constant battle, especially with the federal government, not so much with the state government. The state acknowledges they can't tax our income generated from here on territory. If we live here, we can avoid paying state income tax. If you live out there, or if you work out there, that's a bigger challenge. But it shouldn't be. It shouldn't be a challenge because we are a distinct people. So these are the things that we're always fighting for. But again, it has to be understood that we're not benefiting in the same way because some of the infrastructure. I mean, think about the thruway goes through here. So the thruway cuts through Seneca territory. We can't even get on it on Seneca territory. It generates income for the state. They charge a toll for it. Unfettered access of commerce runs through Seneca territory every minute of every day. Every minute of every day, there are cars and trucks. There are people traveling that throughway, and not just the throughway. Interstate 86 down in Allegheny, 438, Route 5, Route 20, county roads. There's again CSX Tracks. There's a rail system that runs through. I think there's 3 sets of tracks runs through Seneca territory. More commerce, and you know how much they report to the Seneca Nation? None. They don't report a damn thing. The Senecas have no idea what is on a truck that goes through the territory. They aren't getting any permits to cross there. I mean, they could be carrying nuclear waste for all we know. And I'm sure they have. The track, same thing. Bomb trains. 100 cars at a time carrying Bakken crude right on the water's edge of the Seneca Nation. The only access to Lake Erie. Bomb trains running through Seneca territory. There's no special insurances. They don't get any special permits. So even hazardous materials cross Seneca territory unimpeded by Senecas. But when we put cigarettes on a truck and we go from this territory to another territory, we're at a constant risk of being seized. Ask Eric White on that one. So even our native, look, we're not smuggling. We're not taking cigarettes to New York City and selling them to bodegas or whatever else. The only trade that we do is from territory to territory, and most of it's a native product. It's not available anyplace else. It's not. I mean, look, if you see Senecas sold in a at a facility in New York City, then somebody's getting away with something, because we don't sell Senecas to New York City. You know what I'm saying? Or any of the native brands. They just go from one territory to another. That's what we do. And yet, those are at constant risk. It doesn't matter how much unfettered access. Again, it's not even just the rail and the highway. Again, gas lines, phone lines, electric lines, all this stuff going through. And we don't get a discount for that. We're not getting cheap, gas or electric. Even in Allegheny, where 10,000 acres was condemned by the Army Corps of Engineers for the Kinzua Dam, the city of Salamanca gets cheap electric, but not the people living on the Jeffersons town side, on the rest of Allegheny. They're paying a premium price for electric down there. So for all of the things that happen in our territory, I guess the abuses that you'd have to say. I mean, look, these easements were gotten. I mean, it's almost fraud. I mean, the thruway, for instance, the representatives of who negotiated with the Senecas on the thruway, they laughed about how much they got over on the Senecas on that deal. The Senecas wanted a piece of the action. Well, then we want a piece of the tolls. There's no, can't have it. And of course, we didn't exactly have the most skilled negotiators in that situation. But so now this thruway cuts through. They pull in billions of dollars a year off of that thruway. There's billions of dollars worth of commerce, I should say, that is conducted, by crossing through Seneca territory. And they don't have to get off, and they don't have to go through our territories and gas up or anything else. Look, they don't have to do any of that stuff. We don't get any benefit from the thruway. In fact, we don't even use the thruway as it crosses through our territory. We also shouldn't be paying tolls on the thruway, by the way. That goes back to some of the older treaty language as well. But there we are. Not all of us. I mean, we got guys like Will Perry who said, nope, there's no way in hell I'm going to pay a toll on the thruway. He rejects it every single time. So I'll give my hats off to Will. But, these are some of the conflicted areas. None of them more conflicting than the federal taxes, especially income tax, excise taxes. I mean, think about every cigarette product that is sold on our territories. All federal taxes are paid on that. All federal taxes. I mean, there's no state taxes paid on it, no sales tax paid on it, but federal excise tax, which is like $10 a carton. So you think about that. If you buy a carton of Senecas and you're paying $23, $25, whatever it is, $10 of that went to the federal government's making $10 off of that. $10. And then, again, what the federal government wants is not only are they making $10 off the carton of cigarettes, but they're going to try to take 25 to 30% of the wages of the person who sold it to you. I mean, this stuff is the craziness. Now, I know there's many many people out there, native and non-native, who think, wait a minute, I thought that these native people, none of them paid taxes. And there's probably native people saying, wait, we pay all those taxes? I guarantee you, if you go to Walmart, it is damn hard to get away without paying the sales tax there. For years, we've had all these companies says, well, yeah, we can give you recognize your tax exemption if we deliver it to you, and it's going to cost you the same amount for us to deliver it to you as it would have cost you in tax. Staples, Home Depot, they all do the same thing. I mean, it's an absolute scam. There's no question that we should have the right to buy goods without paying taxes. And I'll tell you, especially when we're using them on our territories. And here's the crazy part: the state takes the position that not only do they have the right to tax the sales of products on our territory, except for when they're only for Senecas. The state say, okay, any sale that happens on Seneca territory to a Seneca, we don't have any right to tax that. But they believe, I'm Mohawk. If I go into the smoke shop here and I buy a carton of cigarettes, the state believes they have a right to tax me on that. I mean, they don't, and they can't. I mean, but as long as they hold that belief, here's the thing. They can try to criminalize that activity. They can claim that the sales here are illicit. So it always leaves this shadow of criminality that the state tries to hold over, and that's why guys like Eric White and anybody who's hauling products from one territory to another are at risk. But see, again, talking about the distinction, there's an attempt by the state and federal government to ignore most of that distinction. That's why most of them don't even know what the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples are. You bring that up to a state or a federal politician, they have no idea what you're even talking about. But many of our people don't either. So the whole idea that we need to assert that distinction, not just when somebody's trying to put a pipeline through our territories. That the problem with that mentality is it's too little too late. If we haven't asserted ourselves as a distinct people with authority on what happens on our lands, then we come at these things from a weak position when we're ready to fight. I mean, there are things that we do that are always a little bit complicated. I mean, it's like the casino, for instance, selling booze. I mean, they serve alcohol in the casino. Do they have a state liquor license? Well, why would they need a state liquor license to sell alcohol in a casino? And isn't that hypocritical to say that the state has no right to tax any other product except for alcohol? And if they're not taxing it, then what do you have a license with them for? See, these are some of the things that we don't think all the way through when we're making some of these decisions, and we're taking some of these actions going forward. So and this is part of the lack of education. So when we talk about identity, do we ever teach anybody that they aren't Americans, or that they can be, but the assumption that we are can't be made without our consent? When our boys turn 18 years old, and who knows, might be our girls soon, do we tell our boys, look, you don't have to register for their draft? I mean, look, they don't have a draft in place, but they have a draft registration. And they say it's a crime. It's actually a criminal offense not to register for the draft, and it's punishable. They don't punish anybody, but we can't get a full acknowledgement that our 18-year-old boys don't have to register for the U.S. Selective Services. And of course, some of the things, you could have a challenge when it comes to things like, I don't know, being a police officer, for instance. If you try to do some of these jobs that are community service of some sort, you can't get certain grants and loans, or government grants or whatever to go to college, for instance, if you don't sign up for the draft. So these are some of the things that become these major question marks, because not only do we not teach our own kids or take an initiative with our kids at school age, oftentimes we're not doing it at home either. We don't even second guess this idea. I remember Fall Festival here in Seneca Territory a couple of years ago. Matt and I, we did a count on how many of the parade floats, including all the individual motorcycles, how many of them were carrying American flags. American flags outnumbered even Seneca flags. There wasn't a single warrior or unity flag. No, forget about that. But even the number of Seneca flags or Hiawatha Belt flags, almost non-existent compared to the American flag. And I get it. Look, people are proud of their service in the U.S. Armed Forces or Canadian Armed Forces, but nobody thinks about the consequences of that and where that leaves us in terms of identity, or how we're being used in those situations. But for all of the attempts to distinguish or to extinguish our distinction, we still maintain it, even with church service, military service, American flags, blue jeans, Chevrolets, pickup trucks. even with all that stuff, we still maintain a fair level of distinction. And we should never let that go. And we need to continue to fight taxation issues, land use issues, land encroachment issues, but most importantly, identity issues. There is a difference between us and them. I'm not saying we're better. I'm not saying we're worse. Many of the things that you have out there, we don't have here. But many of those things we can build here if we weren't saddled with the burden that you guys not only have, but benefit from. When you get taxed out there, you get the full benefits of all those taxes. Not so much the same here. Anyway, I don't know if I did a great job defining the difference between us and them, but it's part of the conversation. Hopefully you guys will continue the conversation from here. But it's the conversation we need to have. This is John Kane. This is Let's Talk Native. Thanks for listening. Yowie.